You'll never beat me. Senior Chief Marcus Reed's voice dropped to something quiet and absolute, the kind of quiet that had silenced rooms on 3 continents. 1,040 SEALs stopped breathing, because the woman he had just challenged did not step back, did not look away. Commander Olivia Hayes stood in the center of his briefing room, in front of his operators, on his evaluation day, and said 4 words that nobody in that building had ever said to Marcus Reed. Your plan will fail. The room went cold, and Marcus Reed made the worst mistake of his career. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story to the very end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this has traveled. The morning started the way. Every evaluation day started at Naval Special Warfare Combat Center with controlled noise. Boots on concrete, gear checks, the low professional conversation of people who had already done hard things and were preparing to do them again. The kind of readiness that did not need announcing, because it lived in the body, in the posture, in the way operators moved through a room without wasting motion. There were 1,040 of them that day, not all in one space. They moved through the facility in coordinated groups: instructors, team leaders, operators from different commands, senior enlisted, junior officers working alongside veterans, whose names existed in the kind of records most people never see. The Joint Combat Evaluation was the most demanding exercise of the calendar year. Every team knew what it meant to be selected for it. Every operator who walked through those doors understood the standard they were expected to meet. Nothing about that morning suggested anything unusual was about to happen. Marcus Reed had run evaluations like this before. He had been on both sides of them as a younger operator, being watched and measured, and now as a senior chief with enough time and enough field experience to have become, in the eyes of most people in that building, the standard itself. He did not carry himself with arrogance in the way some men do, loudly, always claiming space in a room. His authority was quieter than that, and more permanent. It came from the fact that when he spoke about combat, about decision-making under pressure, about the physics of how a mission falls apart, and what it takes to hold it together, people stopped and listened. Not because of his rank, because he was usually right. He had been training SEALs for 4 years at this point, after a deployment cycle that included multiple combat theaters, a rotation as a direct action team leader, and a year attached to a joint special operations task force where he had earned a commendation people in his peer group considered the hardest kind, to earn the kind that came from a mission that almost did not work, where his decisions under fire had kept people alive. He did not talk about that commendation. It sat in his official record the way most of the real things sit, invisible to conversation, visible to those who knew where to look. Marcus arrived at the main briefing area early, the way he always did. He liked reading a room before it filled. He liked seeing the space without people in it, understanding the shape of what was about to happen. He pulled up the mission scenario on the briefing board, read through the parameters, and began building the response framework in his head. Rescue of intelligence personnel in a hostile environment. Limited communication assets, compressed time window, multiple threat vectors. He had run variations of this type of scenario 100 times in real conditions and in simulation. He understood the architecture of it. He knew where the pressure points were. He was still studying the map layout when the other operators began filing in. He registered each of them the way experienced people register a room, not consciously cataloging, just noticing. The familiar faces from his own community, a few operators he recognized from other commands. 2 senior officers from the East Coast group he had worked with during a joint exercise 2 years prior. And then, near the back of the room, a woman he had never seen before. She did not announce her arrival. She did not make any particular effort to be noticed or to connect with anyone around her. She moved to a position near the wall, slightly offset from the main cluster of operators, and she studied the briefing board with the kind of attention that suggested she had already done a great deal of thinking before she entered. She was not young in the way of someone new to the work. She carried herself with the specific calibration of someone who had learned, through real experience, exactly how much energy to spend and where to spend it. Her uniform carried no unit patch that Marcus immediately recognized. No visible decorations, no identifiers that placed her in any particular box. She simply stood there and looked at the map. Marcus noticed her, the way he noticed anything that did not fit a pattern he already understood. A brief flicker of attention, then he moved on. The briefing began. The scenario commander walked them through the parameters. Hostile territory. Intelligence personnel compromised in a forward position. A rescue team needed to move through a complex environment with 3 separate threat zones, coordinated by a command element, working from a position with limited visibility of the full operational picture. Communication assets were rated as 50% reliable. Extraction windows were subject to change. The evaluation would be scored on objective completion, team survivability in the simulation, and decision quality under pressure. Marcus listened. He already had a framework built. He would take the mission commander role. He would move the team fast, establish dominance at the contact point, and drive toward the objective with enough force to prevent the scenario from developing complications. In his experience, the missions that went wrong were usually the ones where teams waited too long, second-guessed themselves into paralysis, and gave a dynamic situation too much time to become worse. Speed was a form of protection. Aggression, properly applied, was a decision-making advantage. He was walking the group through his initial assessment when the woman near the wall spoke. Her voice was not loud. It was not designed to cut through the room the way some voices are, the kind of tone that performs authority before it earns it. But there was a quality to it that made people turn. A settled certainty. The kind of voice that has said difficult things before and has not been wrong often enough to stop saying them. The plan has a structural problem, she said. The room did not exactly go silent. There was a pause, that particular pause that happens when something unexpected enters a space and the people in it are recalibrating. Marcus turned toward her slowly. Say again. The plan has a structural problem, she repeated, and she gestured toward the briefing board. Your movement sequence puts the extraction element in a predictable corridor. If the threat environment is dynamic, which the scenario specifies, you're committing to a timeline before you have the information to justify it. Someone near the front of the room exhaled, not dramatically. Just the small, involuntary sound of tension entering a body. Marcus studied her for a moment. He kept his expression neutral, the way he always did when he was working out what something meant. She was not nervous. She had no appearance of someone who had said something impulsive and was now waiting to see what happened. She looked like a person who had made an observation that was, in her assessment, factually correct, and who was now simply waiting for a response. "Who are you?" he asked. The question was not hostile. It was the straightforward request for context that the situation required. "Commander Olivia Hayes," she said, reporting for the joint evaluation. "What's your background, Commander?" She held his gaze for a second before answering. "Reconnaissance, adaptive operations, some intelligence support work." Marcus nodded once. Slowly, he looked at the briefing board. Then he looked back at her. "What's your read on the problem?" "The problem," she said, "is the assumption that speed eliminates uncertainty. It doesn't. It just moves you through uncertainty faster. If your intelligence picture is incomplete, and in this scenario, there's a strong probability it is, you can outrun the information you need to make the right decision when it actually matters." The room was fully quiet now, not the tense quiet of conflict. The focused quiet of people paying close attention to something that is asking something of them. Marcus felt something that he would not have called discomfort exactly. More like friction. The sensation of an assumption being pressed against and not immediately giving way. He had built his tactical thinking around a principle that had worked in real conditions, not just simulation, in places where the cost of being wrong was not a score on a board but a name on a wall. And now a woman he had never met was standing in his briefing room, telling him the foundation of that principle had a crack in it. He had two options. He could dismiss her, It would have been easy. He had the rank, the reputation, the room's attention. He could have moved the briefing forward and let the scenario play out the way he intended. He was reasonably confident he would win. He was almost always right. Instead, he said, "You think you can do it better?" She did not hesitate. "I think the plan has a weakness." He stepped forward, not aggressively, but with the full weight of 16 years behind the movement. "I've run this kind of mission in actual hostile territory. I've made these calls with people's lives on the table. You're talking to me about structural problems in a simulation. I'm not questioning your experience," she said. "I'm questioning the plan." The distinction landed in the room like a stone into still water. Because it was precise, and because every experienced operator in that space could hear, underneath the words, the exact nature of what she was saying. She was not attacking Marcus. She was pointing at something. And the fact that she kept pointing at it, calmly, without backing down, meant she believed she was right. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. "You'll never beat me," he said. The words came out the way things come out when they live deeper than calculation, from a place that is not entirely out about the other person, but about something inside the speaker that has not been tested in a while, and is suddenly, unexpectedly aware of that fact. Olivia Hayes did not smile. She did not look away. She simply nodded, once, and said, "We'll see." The challenge had been issued. The room had heard it, and now, for the first time in a very long time, nobody wasn't quite yet certain what was going to happen next. The evaluation commander stepped in to formalize what the room had just decided on its own. The exercise would be restructured. 2 teams, 2 commanders. Same scenario, same resources. The results would be objective and quantified. There would be no room for interpretation about who had performed better, because the simulation's scoring system recorded everything: movement decisions, communication choices, casualty rates, objective completion, time elapsed, and the specific branching points where each team made decisions that could be retroactively analyzed. Marcus chose his team the way he always did, by experience and capability. He took 3 of the most technically skilled operators in the room. Men he had worked with before, or men whose records he trusted. He designed his team for speed and decisiveness. He wanted a unit that could execute his commands without friction and push through whatever the scenario threw at them. Olivia selected her team differently. She did not pick the most experienced operators. She picked the operators who had been paying the closest attention during the briefing. One of them was a young petty officer who had never led a mission at this level. Another was a senior operator from a coastal command whose specialty was signals intelligence. The third was a woman from the evaluation cadre whose background was in logistics and supply chain, a specialty that seemed entirely unrelated to the tactical demands of the mission. Marcus noticed her selections. He said nothing, but several of the operators around him did. "She's playing a different game," one of them said. "She's not playing a game at all," another answered. "She's just not playing the same one we're used to." Before the simulation began, there was a preparation period. Each team had 40 minutes to review the scenario parameters, build their plan, and brief their operators. Marcus ran his preparation with efficiency. He had the plan built in 12 minutes. He spent the remaining 28 walking his team through execution details, movement speeds, contact protocols, fallback positions, communication checkpoints. His operators knew their roles precisely. They were ready. He glanced across the room at Olivia's team. They were still talking. Not arguing, talking. She was asking each operator something, leaning in, listening, nodding, then asking something else. The young petty officer was drawing something on a notepad. The signal specialist was pointing at sections of the scenario map and explaining something to the logistics operator, who was listening with the careful attention of someone learning something genuinely new. It looked less like a mission brief and more like a conversation between people who were trying to understand something together. Marcus felt the friction again. He redirected his attention to his own team. When the simulation began, Marcus moved his team immediately. His execution was clean. His operators were disciplined. They hit their first checkpoint in exactly the time he had planned. They established communication with the simulated command element, received the initial intelligence picture, and pressed forward. Everything was running the way it was supposed to run. Olivia's team moved more slowly at the start. They spent almost 8 minutes in the first position, which in Marcus's tactical framework was 8 minutes of exposure and delay that served no purpose. He could see their icon on the shared evaluation board, stationary, while his team was already advancing. "She's overthinking it," one of his operators said. Marcus said nothing. He was watching the board with an expression that had gone very still. Then the first scenario event triggered. It was a standard disruption, the kind of complication that experienced operators expected and planned for. A section of the planned movement route was declared compromised. The simulated intelligence source had been located by hostile elements. The extraction window shifted by 12 minutes. These were the kinds of changes that Marcus's framework handled automatically. He had contingency responses built. He adjusted the plan, redirected his team, and kept moving. His team hit the second checkpoint 6 minutes ahead of projected time. On the evaluation board, Olivia's team was now moving. And they were not using the route that the scenario had originally made available. They were moving through a section of the simulated terrain that had not been flagged in the briefing as a primary option, a longer path, more indirect, that curved around the eastern edge of the threat zone instead of pushing through its center. "Why is she going east?" one of Marcus's operators asked. "Because she doesn't trust the western corridor," Marcus said. He said it before he had fully thought through why he was saying it, and the moment the words were out, he understood that he had, on some level, already registered the implication. The western corridor was where his team was. He pushed the thought aside. He had evaluated that corridor. The risk profile was acceptable. He had made the call. He trusted the call. They reached the third checkpoint. The simulation was running well. His team was performing exactly as trained. Marcus was in command, and the mission was proceeding according to his direction. Then the second disruption hit. It was larger than the first. The hostile element in the simulation had repositioned not randomly, but in a pattern that closed off the approach to the primary objective through the western corridor. The simulated enemy was not reacting to random chance. It was responding to the movement signature of his team. Every standard tactical approach that Marcus's training represented, every predictable SEAL movement pattern, the simulation's hostile AI, had been programmed to recognize and counter them. Marcus stopped. He looked at the board. He looked at the map. He looked at the pattern of enemy repositioning. Then he looked at where Olivia's team was. They were already past the point where the hostile repositioning would have trapped them. Because they had never gone through the western corridor. They had taken the longer route that nobody else would have taken, not because it was easier, but because it was unexpected. Marcus made a rapid decision. He redirected his team. He acknowledged the change in conditions and issued new movement orders. He was still running on discipline and tactical clarity. He was still going to complete the objective. He had not lost. The mission was not over, but something had shifted in the room. The 1,040 operators watching the evaluation board had gone very quiet. Because the experienced ones, the ones with enough time on them to understand what they were seeing, had already recognized the pattern. They had seen Marcus's team adjust. They had seen it in the way competent operators always adjust, with professionalism and controlled adaptation. But they had also seen Olivia's team never need to adjust, because the decision that looked like caution at the start had turned out to be, from a distance, the decision of someone who already understood what was coming. In the preparation room, during the break that the scenario provided, Marcus sat with his team. He was still composed. His body language was exactly what it always was, upright, settled, controlled. He had spent years learning to carry himself that way in the field, because operators read their leaders, and leaders who appear uncertain create uncertainty in their teams. But inside, something was running that he did not have a clean word for. Not fear, not exactly doubt, more like the sensation of a structure he had built very carefully beginning to produce sounds it had not made before. Not collapsing, just registering something new, something it had not been designed to account for. He had told her she would never beat him. He had meant it the way he meant most things completely, based on everything he understood about the world. He had not been performing confidence. He was confident. The confidence was real. It had to be real, because false confidence in his field was a liability that eventually produced casualties. But he was sitting in a preparation room mid-simulation, watching a woman he had never met do something with a mission that he had not considered doing. And the reason he had not considered it was not that it was impossible. It was that his framework did not include it. He had built his thinking around a set of principles that had worked so consistently, in conditions so demanding, that he had, at some point without noticing it, stopped checking whether the principles themselves still needed to grow. He was not sure when that had happened. He thought about the young petty officer on Olivia's team. He thought about the question he had watched her ask each of her operators during the preparation period, that leaning in, listening posture, the careful attention. He had assumed she was compensating for inexperience, building trust with operators who might not follow her otherwise. Managing a team that was not naturally cohesive, he was no longer sure that was what she had been doing. "Senior Chief," one of his operators said, "we're back on in 4 minutes." Marcus stood. He straightened his posture. He looked at the map one more time. "Change of approach," he said. "We go north of the second checkpoint. Longer route. Takes us outside the predicted response corridor." His operators looked at him. They did not question it. They trusted him. They had always trusted him. "Copy," the lead operator said. "What changed?" Marcus picked up his gear. "The situation," he said. The situation changed. It was a true answer. And it was also, if he was being honest with himself in the way that men like him are almost never fully honest with themselves in the middle of a mission, only part of the answer. Because what had really changed was not just the situation. Something in Marcus Reed himself had moved, very slightly, in a direction he had not been standing in before. And he did not yet have a name for what that movement was, or where it was going to take him. The evaluation board showed both teams in motion. The final phase was 20 minutes away. And for the first time since the morning began, nobody in that room was certain how it was going to end. The 4-minute warning sounded. Marcus looked at his team. They were ready. They were always ready. That was the one thing he had never doubted, and still did not doubt now. Even as everything else in his understanding of this particular morning was undergoing something he could not fully articulate. He stepped toward the simulation threshold. Behind him, from somewhere in the observation area, a voice said quietly, not to him, not to anyone specific, just into the air of the room, the way truth sometimes enters spaces when people are not defending against it. "She's not trying to beat him." Marcus heard it. He did not turn around. But he heard it, and, for the first time since the challenge began, he allowed himself to wonder whether the person who had said that was right, and what it would mean if they were. Marcus stepped back into the simulation with his jaws set and his plan revised, and his team moving in a formation that felt, in the first minutes, like it was going to work. The northern route added 8 minutes to the approach. 8 minutes was a cost. He accepted the cost because he had made the calculation, and the calculation said the trade-off was worth it. Avoid the predicted response corridor. Come at the objective from a direction the hostile element was not positioned to counter. Reach the extraction point with his team intact and the personnel secured. Win the evaluation. That was still the plan. He had not abandoned anything. He had adapted. There was a difference between adapting and retreating. And Marcus Reed understood that difference the way some people understand their own name bone deep without having to think about it. His lead operator, a man named Torres, whose career stretched across 12 years and 2 combat theaters, moved slightly to Marcus's left and said quietly, "The AI on this simulation is smarter than last year's version." "It's not smarter," Marcus said. "It's just been given better information about how we move." Torres processed that. Meaning? Meaning someone programmed it to recognize standard SEAL movement patterns and respond to them. Which means the more textbook we run this, the more predictable we become. Torres said nothing for a moment. Then, "You think she knew that going in?" Marcus kept walking. "I think she asked questions until she figured it out." That was the thing that was working on him as they moved. Not the tactical adjustment. Not even the fact that Olivia's team was currently ahead on the evaluation board, which it was. He had checked before the final phase began, and her icon sat closer to the objective than his. Not dramatically, but measurably. The kind of margin that was small enough to close and large enough to matter. What was working on him was the preparation period. That 40 minutes, he kept returning to the image of her, sitting with her team and asking questions. Not giving answers, asking questions. He had spent his preparation period briefing his team, walking them through his plan, because his plan was good. His plan was built from 16 years of knowing what works. He had given them the strategy, and they had received it, and they had been ready to execute because they were professional and professionals execute. Olivia had spent her preparation period finding out what her team already knew. The distinction was so small it was almost invisible. And yet, standing in the middle of a simulation, with a revised plan and a closed margin and a woman he had challenged in front of 1,000 people who was currently, by every objective measure, performing at a level he had not anticipated standing there, Marcus Reed could feel the weight of that distinction pressing on him in a way he did not know how to put down. His radio crackled. The simulated command element issued an update. The intelligence personnel they were tasked to rescue had moved from their last known position. New coordinates placed them 70 meters south of the original location, inside a section of the simulated terrain that sat at the edge of both teams' approach routes. Marcus stopped. He looked at the updated coordinates. He ran the geometry in his head. Then he opened his team channel. Updated objective position, 70 meters south. "We're adjusting our final approach angle." "Copy," Torres said. "What's Olivia's team going to do?" Marcus looked at the board. Her team had already moved. They had adjusted before he had finished issuing his own update. Not faster, because they had been told sooner they had received the same update at the same moment. Faster, because the adjustment required for their route was smaller. Because the direction they had been moving in already accounted for the possibility that the objective position would change. He stared at the board for 3 seconds longer than he needed to. "Move," he said. The next 8 minutes were the most disciplined piece of operational movement Marcus had produced in a simulation environment in 4 years of instruction. His team was precise, every angle correct, every communication checkpoint hit inside the window. The northern approach worked exactly as he had redesigned it. When they reached the final position before the objective, his casualties in the simulation were 2, both from an early engagement in the first phase. Before the route adjustment. Since the adjustment, his team had taken 0 additional simulated losses. He was good at this. That had not changed. The woman challenging him did not change the fact that he was genuinely, measurably, objectively good at this. And then the final scenario event triggered. It hit both teams simultaneously. The simulated communication system dropped to 15% functionality. Not a total failure, just enough degradation to make coordinated command nearly impossible. The extraction window moved again, this time compressing by 9 minutes instead of expanding. And a new hostile element appeared in the simulation, not at the objective, not on any approach route, but at the extraction point itself. Which meant that completing the rescue mission and successfully extracting were no longer the same problem. The observation room, which had been running at the low, professional murmur of experienced people, watching something they understood, went entirely quiet. Because every operator watching that board recognized what had just happened. The scenario had been escalated to the level where a commander's real decision-making architecture became visible. Not the disciplined execution of a prepared plan. The actual structure underneath the assumptions, the hierarchy of priorities, the answer to the question that every command to the field eventually has to answer when everything changes at once, what matters most. Marcus heard his team's voices on the radio, controlled, professional, waiting for his direction. He had 9 seconds before the window for a decision that would affect the entire outcome, opened and then closed. He made the call, objective first, extract what you came for. Deal with the extraction point complication on approach, not in advance, because moving toward a confirmed hostile position without the personnel in hand was a sequential logic error. You rescue first, you extract second, you solve problems in the order they appear. He issued his orders, his team moved. On the other side of the evaluation board, Olivia's team did something different. They split. One element, 2 operators went to the objective position. The other element, Olivia and 1 operator, moved toward the extraction point. Not to engage the new hostile presence. To find a secondary extraction route that the scenario had not advertised but that existed, buried in the technical parameters of the simulation, because Olivia's team had found it during the preparation period. The logistics operator, the one Marcus had looked at and silently questioned, had been the one who found it. Because logistics people understand secondary routes. They understand what happens when the primary path closes, and there needs to be another one. It was, in the operational sense, her entire professional specialty applied to a problem everyone else had treated as purely tactical. The 2 operator element reached the objective and secured the personnel inside 40 seconds. Olivia reached the secondary extraction point inside 90 seconds. The merge happened in 2 minutes and 11 seconds. Marcus's team reached the objective in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. He had no secondary extraction route. He had the primary route with a hostile element on it, and he had the skill and the aggression and the tactical clarity to push through it, which he did, and his team sustained 4 additional simulated casualties doing it. And they extracted with the personnel secured, and the mission was technically complete. The simulation ended. The evaluation board populated its final numbers. Team Reed, objective secured, personnel extracted. Simulated casualties 6, Team Hayes, objective secured. Personnel extracted. Simulated casualties 0. The observation room did not react immediately. There was a pause that lasted almost 15 seconds, which, in a room full of people who never waste 15 seconds, was enormous. It was the pause of people doing the cognitive work of absorbing something that required them to update an assumption they had not realized they were carrying. Then, not all at once, but in a wave that moved through the room like something physical, the operators began talking. Not loudly, not dramatically. In the low, intense, technical that experienced. People talk when they have just witnessed something that is going to change how they think, something they thought they already understood. Marcus stood at the edge of the evaluation space and looked at the board for a long time. Torres appeared at his shoulder, quiet, not saying anything. The specific silence of someone who respects the person next to them, enough not to fill a moment that does not need filling. Marcus said, "Where did the secondary route come from?" Torres said, "The logistics specialist found it. Apparently it was in the technical scenario parameters. A secondary extraction corridor that was available if a team identified it during prep." "How long did it take her to find it?" Torres was quiet for a moment. About 11 minutes into the prep period, right around the time Hayes was finishing her round of questions with the team. 11 minutes. While Marcus had been briefing his operators on his plan, Olivia had been asking her operators what they knew. And what they knew, it turned out, included something that changed the entire shape of the problem. He turned and looked across the room to where Olivia was standing with her team. She was not celebrating. She was not performing anything for the observers. She was talking to the young petty officer, the one Marcus had written off as an inexperienced selection. And from the posture of the conversation, it looked like she was asking him something rather than telling him something. Even now, even after the evaluation had ended, Marcus watched that for 3 seconds. Then he looked away. He felt the room's attention on him without anyone making it explicit. He was Senior Chief Marcus Reed. He had a public record and a professional reputation, and he had made a challenge in front of 1,040 people that had just been answered in a way that was going to be discussed in this community for a long time. He understood that. He was not unaware of the social physics of the moment. But what he was aware of, more than the room, more than the observers, more than the board and the numbers, and the professional accounting of what had just happened, was something quieter and more persistent. A question that had started forming in the preparation period and had been building through every phase of the evaluation and was now sitting in the center of his chest like something that needed answering before he could move forward in any honest way. The question was not whether Olivia Hayes was good. The answer to that was no longer in question. She was exceptional. He had seen enough to know the difference between competence and something rarer, and what she had just demonstrated was rarer. The question was why he had not seen it, why he had looked at her quiet presence at the start of the briefing and read it as uncertainty rather than assessment. Why he had heard her challenge to his plan and felt it as an attack on his authority rather than as what it actually was, a technical observation from someone who had already done work he had not done yet. Why he had issued a challenge that, in retrospect, was not really about the mission at all. It was about the fact that his framework had been pressed against, and he had not liked the feeling of being pressed. He was honest enough, standing in that room, with the board still showing the numbers, to sit with that question without immediately answering it. One of the senior officers from the East Coast group moved to stand beside him. A man named Broderick, who had 30 years in the community and whose opinion Marcus had respected since before he had earned the right to stand in the same room with him. Broderick looked at the board. Then he looked at Marcus. Then he said, "You ran a good mission." "She ran a better one," Marcus said. Broderick nodded. He did not argue. "What are you going to do with that?" Marcus said nothing for a moment. He was still looking at the board. At the numbers, at the 6 beside his name and the 0 beside hers. "I don't know yet," he said. "I'm still working it out." Broderick said, "That's the right answer," and then he walked away. Across the room, the evaluation commander was beginning to move toward the debrief position. The formal assessment would happen in 20 minutes. Both teams would stand in front of the full group, and the scenario would be analyzed in detail, every decision point examined, every fork in the road revisited with the hindsight that real-time decision-making never allows. Marcus had sat in those debriefs dozens of times. He had led them as an instructor. He understood how they worked. What he was less sure of was how this particular one was going to feel. He started toward the debrief area. Torres fell into step beside him, and behind them the rest of his team moved with the quiet professionalism that had characterized everything they had done that day. They had not failed. They had been led by someone who made different choices than the scenario ultimately rewarded. The distinction mattered. Marcus believed it mattered. He was going to hold on to that belief because it was true, and also because some truths exist in multiple layers, and the layer you are standing on, at any given moment, is not always the whole picture. He passed within a few feet of Olivia on his way to the debrief. She looked up from the conversation she was still having with the young petty officer. Their eyes met. She did not say anything, neither did he. But there was something in the exchange that lasted less than 2 seconds and carried more information than most conversations carry in several minutes, the specific kind of recognition that passes between two people who have been in genuine competition and who both understand, without needing to articulate it, that what just happened was real. Not a simulation, not a score. Real in the way that only things that cost something are real. He moved past her. Behind him he heard the petty officer say something to her in a low voice. He did not catch the words. He heard her response. "You found the route," she said. I just made sure you had room to say it. Marcus slowed his steps for half a second, just half a second. Then he kept walking. He took his position in the debrief area. The evaluation commander called the room to attention. The board came up on the main screen, both teams' complete decision trees laid out in the visual format that made the anatomy of a mission readable, in a way that real-time experience never allowed. Marcus looked at the two trees side by side. He looked at the points where they diverged. He looked at the preparation phase analysis, which showed Olivia's team's internal communication patterns, and the specific moment when the logistics operator had surfaced the secondary extraction route. He looked at his own preparation phase, the clear, efficient, one-directional flow of information from him to his team. Fast, disciplined, effective in every traditional measure, and producing in retrospect a team that was exactly as capable as Marcus had made them, and nothing more. Olivia's team had been different. Her operators had not executed her plan. They had built a plan together, and the plan had included information that none of them had individually, but that existed in between them when she created the conditions for it to surface. The evaluation commander began the debrief. He called on Marcus first. Standard protocol, the senior operator speaks first. Marcus stood. He looked out at 1,040 people who had watched everything that morning. He had spent 16 years building a professional identity in this room and in rooms like it. He knew what he was expected to say. He could say the correct professional things about adaptation and tactical adjustment and the dynamic nature of simulation environments. He could frame the result in a way that was accurate without being entirely honest. He did not do that. My plan was technically sound, he said. My team executed it professionally. We completed the objective, he paused. We took 6 casualties we should not have taken. And the reason we took them is that I built my plan alone, and I briefed my team, and I was confident that 16 years of experience was the complete answer to the problem in front of me. Another pause. Longer this time. It wasn't. There was information in that room that I did not access because I was not asking for it. That's on me. The room did not react dramatically. But the quality of the silence shifted in a way that anyone paying attention could feel. Because what Marcus had just done, standing in front of 1,000 peers and saying those words with that specificity, was not what most people did when they lost. Most people managed the loss. They explained it. They contextualized it. They preserved the professional narrative around themselves. It was understandable. It was even in some ways professionally rational. Marcus had not done that. He sat down. He did not look at Olivia. But from his peripheral vision, he was aware of her, sitting very still, watching him with an expression he could not fully read, but that contained something not satisfaction, not victory, not the particular quality of someone watching an opponent diminished. Something more like recognition. The debrief continued. The evaluation commander walked through the scenario architecture, the deliberate design, detection that used operators' own predictable patterns against them. The decision to include a secondary extraction route that was technically available but practically invisible, unless someone in the preparation phase knew to look for it and had the specific expertise to find it. The scoring methodology, the communication degradation event, and what it was designed to test about leadership under fragmented information conditions. And then the evaluation commander said, the team that won this evaluation did not win because their commander was more experienced. They won because their commander understood something that takes most leaders years to fully learn. He paused. You are never the only person in the room with information you need. He looked at Marcus when he said it, not unkindly. The way a person looks at someone they are speaking to, honestly, because they believe the person can receive it. Marcus held the look. He was 43 minutes removed from the moment he had stepped forward and said she would never beat him. He was 43 minutes into understanding what it meant that he had been wrong. Not just about the outcome, about the deeper thing underneath the outcome, the assumption that had produced the challenge in the first place. The assumption that experience accumulated into a kind of completeness. That a person who had learned enough, done enough, survived enough, arrived at a state where the most important thing was to execute what they already knew. He had believed that. He had built his professional identity on it. It had served him well in conditions where the assumptions behind it had mostly held. What today had shown him was what happened when those conditions changed. When the problem was not the kind of problem that yielded to what he already knew. When the answer was not in 16 years of accumulated knowledge, but in a conversation he had not had and a question he had not asked. The debrief ended. The room broke into movement, the natural dissolution of a structured event into the scattered conversations that follow. Marcus sat for a moment without moving, not performing anything. Just sitting with the weight of the morning. Torres appeared beside him again. Settled into the chair next to him the way someone does when they have something to say and are deciding how to say it. "Senior Chief," Torres said, "for what it's worth. I've been on a lot of teams. I've seen a lot of commanders take a hit in a debrief." He stopped. Marcus waited. "What you just said up there, that's not something most people do." Marcus looked at him. Was it the right thing to do? Torres thought about it for a second, genuinely considered it, the way Marcus had always respected about him. "Yeah," he said. Marcus nodded. He stood. He looked across the room one more time toward the evaluation board, still showing the final numbers. 6 and 0. He had been on the wrong side of a challenge for the first time in a very long time. And what he was discovering in the aftermath was that the wrong side of an honest challenge was not where careers ended. It was where real learning began. He picked up his gear and walked toward the door. He did not sleep well that night. Marcus was not someone who lost sleep easily. He had slept in conditions that would have kept most people awake permanently in forward positions with hostile contact possible at any moment. In the hours before missions where the margin for error was measured in seconds and the cost of a mistake was someone's life. He had trained himself, over years, to sleep when sleep was available, because the body needed it and the mind needed it, and a commander who arrived at a decision point exhausted was a commander who made preventable errors. But that night, in his quarters on base, he lay on his back and stared at a ceiling he could not see in the dark and ran the evaluation forward and backward, through his mind, the way a mechanic runs a diagnostic, not looking for excuses, just trying to understand the machinery. 6 casualties, 0 casualties. The numbers were simple. The numbers were not the whole story, but they were not irrelevant either. And Marcus had spent his career in a community that respected the language of results, because results were the only language that the real world spoke without ambiguity. The secondary extraction route. He kept coming back to that. It had been there, inside the technical parameters of the simulation, available to anyone who looked for it, and nobody on his team had looked for it because he had not created space for looking. He had filled the preparation period with his plan, and his plan had been built on everything he knew, and everything he knew had not included the question the logistics operator had apparently asked within 11 minutes of sitting down with Olivia's team. What happens if the primary route closes? It was not a complicated question. It was not even a particularly sophisticated question. It was the kind of question that lived at the edge of any serious operational plan, the what-if, that separated good planning from great planning. Marcus had asked that question hundreds of times in his career. He had built contingency frameworks around it. He was not a man who ignored risk. But he had not asked it today. He had answered it before it was asked, because his framework already contained a contingency response, and he had briefed that contingency to his team, and he had assumed that the contingency he had prepared was sufficient. It had not been sufficient, because it was his contingency built from his knowledge, his experience, his read of the situation, and there had been knowledge in that room he had not accessed. Knowledge that lived in a woman who understood supply lines and alternative routes and the specific geography of what happens when the first plan stops being viable. He sat up at 215. He did not turn on a light. He sat in the dark and breathed and let the weight of the day settle into him without fighting it. The way you sometimes have to let something hurt before you can understand what the hurting is telling you. He thought about the challenge. Those 3 words. You will never beat me. He had issued them in front of 1,000 people, and he had meant them, and they had been wrong. And the wrongness of them was not the part that kept him awake. The wrongness was correctable. The scoreboard had corrected it. What kept him awake was the part underneath the mechanism that had produced the challenge. The thing inside him that had heard a technical observation about a plan he had built, and had felt it, immediately, instinctively, as a threat. Not to the plan, to himself. He sat with that for a long time. The next morning, he arrived at the training facility before 600. The floor was quiet. The overnight crew was finishing their rotation. The morning watch was not yet fully in place. In the specific corridor between the equipment room and the main briefing area, he stopped when he saw that the evaluation board from yesterday was still posted on the analysis wall. The split decision trees, both teams' complete mission paths, preserved for the kind of post-exercise review that the instructional staff would run over the next several days. He stood in front of it alone. He read it the way you read something when there is no one around to watch you read it, without the social performance that accompanies public examination of something that makes you uncomfortable. He read it slowly. He followed his own decision tree from the preparation phase through every branch, every choice, every moment where the class split. And he had gone one direction, and the scenario had eventually shown him that another direction existed. He was still standing there when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned. Olivia Hayes stood 12 feet away, in her physical training gear, holding a cup of coffee in one hand and looking at the board with the same expression she had worn at every point of the preceding day that settled. Assessing quality that he now understood was not distance but depth. She had not been holding herself back from the situation. She had been fully present in it, in a way that looked like detachment from the outside, because it was so much calmer than what most people did when they were fully engaged. You're here early, he said. I usually am, she said. She looked at the board. How long have you been standing here? About 20 minutes. She moved to stand beside him. Not close, a professional distance. The two of them looked at the analysis wall together. Marcus said, the secondary route. I want to understand how your operator found it. Olivia took a small sip of coffee before answering. She didn't find it in the way you mean. She didn't go looking for a secondary route specifically. She was thinking about what happens when the primary route closes. That's how she thinks about every operational environment. She asked me what the extraction priority was if the primary option became unavailable. I told her I didn't know yet and asked her what she thought. She spent about 6 minutes going through the technical parameters and found it. Marcus was quiet for a moment. You told her you didn't know. I didn't know. Not at that point. Most commanders don't say that to their operators. Most commanders don't get the information their operators have, she said. She said it without judgment, purely as a statement of mechanical fact, the way someone describes a physical process. He looked at the board again. His decision tree. The clean, efficient, downward-flowing structure of a plan built entirely inside one mind. I've been running teams for 12 years, he said. I've never lost a man to a decision I made. That's not nothing. No, she said, it isn't. That's real. What you've done is real. But today the mission required something you weren't set up to give it. She paused. Not because you're not capable. Because you had a system that worked so well for so long that you stopped checking whether it was still the right system. The words landed without softening, and Marcus absorbed them the way he absorbed difficult things, by letting them be true before deciding what to do with them. Across the facility, the first operators of the morning watch were beginning to appear. The low sounds of a base waking up drifted through the space-distant voices, equipment, the functional rhythm of a professional community moving into its day. Neither of them acknowledged it. I want to understand your preparation method, Marcus said. Not to replicate it, to understand it. Olivia turned to look at him for the first time since she had come to stand beside him. She studied him with that careful attention, the same quality she had brought to the briefing board the morning before, to the mission map, to every operator on her team. "What specifically do you want to understand?" she asked. "You asked each of your operators a question during the prep period. I watched you do it. You went to each one, you leaned in, you listened. What were you asking them?" She considered the question for a moment. Then she said, "I asked them what they were most worried about." Marcus blinked, just once, briefly, the involuntary response to something that is both simpler and more significant than expected. That's it, not what they knew, not their specialty. What they were worried about, what someone worries about tells you what they're paying attention to, she said. And what they're paying attention to tells you what information they're carrying. Most operators don't volunteer information up the chain unless they're directly asked. And they almost never volunteer what's bothering them. But if you ask, and if they believe you actually want to know, they tell you things that are worth knowing. She took another small sip of coffee. The logistics specialist was worried about what happens if the extraction fails. Not fails strategically, fails logistically. The physical route is compromised, the window is gone, you have people and no way out. That's what she thinks about. It's what she's always thought about. So, when I asked her what she was worried about, she immediately went to the extraction corridor, and she looked at it the way she looks at everything, as a logistics problem. And she found the secondary route, because she was already looking in the right direction. Marcus said nothing for a long moment. He looked at his own decision tree on the wall. At the preparation phase entry that showed a single, clean, unidirectional brief. "If I had asked my team that question," he said slowly, "what would Torres have said?" Olivia said, "You'd have to ask Torres, I'm asking you." "You watched my team in that room." She held his gaze. Then she said, "My read. Torres was worried about the western corridor from the start. He'd seen that approach pattern fail in a previous exercise. He never said it because you hadn't created space for doubt in your brief. You came in with the plan complete, and your operators trust you, so they executed the plan." The doubt went down. Marcus felt something move through him that he did not have a clean name for. It was not shame, exactly. It was the specific sensation of understanding something that you already should have known but did not know you did not know. The particular pain of a blind spot becoming visible. "He would have told me," Marcus said, "if I had asked." "He would have told you," Olivia agreed. The morning sounds continued to build around them. The analysis wall stood between them like a document. 2 decision trees, 2 preparation philosophies. 2 sets of results that were now permanently attached to the day, to both of them, to every operator who had watched. "I owe you an apology," Marcus said. Olivia looked at him without expression, waiting. "When you pointed out the structural problem in my plan, I heard it as an attack. I responded to it like an attack. That was wrong. You were doing what a good officer does, identifying a problem before it costs something." She held the look for a moment before responding. "The challenge didn't bother me," she said. "I've been in that situation before. Someone with more rank and more reputation and more history in the room deciding that the right response to a technical observations is to make it personal. Did it work the other times?" Something moved across her face, not quite a smile. Something more restrained and more complex. "Sometimes it worked," she said. "Depended on who was watching. Yesterday it didn't work." "Yesterday you had 1,000 experienced operators watching," she said. "And the mission told the truth about both of us." That phrase stopped him. He repeated it. Inside himself, the mission told the truth about both of us, and he understood what she meant by both. Not just his failures. Both. There was something in her performance that she was equally accountable to, and she was not exempt from the examination simply because she had won. "What would you have done differently?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. "I would have said more in the briefing. When I identified the structural problem, I stopped at identifying it. I didn't offer the solution in the same breath. I was testing whether the room would hear the problem. It would have been more useful to say, the plan has a weakness, and here is one way to address it. Instead, I waited for you to react. That put you in a position you didn't need to be in." He stared at her. You're telling me you contributed to how the challenge happened. I made a choice that I knew was likely to produce friction, and I made it anyway because I was more interested in the truth of the problem than in the smoothness of the social dynamic. She paused. That's a pattern I have. It's not always the right call. The honesty of it was so direct that it took him a beat to fully absorb it. In the world Marcus lived in the world of professional military performance, of rank and reputation, and the social architecture of a community, where how you carry yourself matters almost as much as what you can do. The kind of self-examination Olivia had just offered was not common. People were accountable to results. They were not often accountable to the interior mechanisms that produced results. You think about that, he said. The social dynamic. I think about how information travels, she said. The social dynamic is part of how information travels. If I make an observation in a way that triggers a defensive response, the information doesn't land. It becomes noise in a conflict, which is worse than not saying it. Marcus looked at the board one more time, then he looked at her. The adaptive combat leadership methods, the ones I was told your classified record is based on. Are they published anywhere? Parts of them. The components that came out of the official review are in the institutional record. The rest is still being developed. Can I read what's available? She looked at him for a moment, with the particular attention that felt by now familiar, that careful read that was not invasive but was entirely comprehensive. Then she said, I'll send you what I can access. The morning watch was fully operational now. Instructors moving through the facility, early training groups assembling, the organized energy of a training day beginning to build. In a few hours, Marcus would be back in front of operators, running the afternoon's evaluation cycle. The work continued, it always continued, but something had shifted in the architecture of the morning that Marcus could feel in the specific way you feel a change in load-bearing structure, not dramatically, not with any collapse, but with the subtle difference in how a space sounds and responds when something fundamental inside it has been adjusted. He picked up his gear. He was 3 steps toward the door when he stopped and turned back. The petty officer, he said, the young one, on your team. Olivia waited. He was good, Marcus said. I watched him work the extraction problem in the second phase. He was tracking 3 variables simultaneously, and he was right about all 3. Where did he come from? Class 342, she said. He graduated 8 months ago. He requested the joint evaluation because he wanted to see how senior operators made decisions under pressure. Nobody thought he was ready. Who put him on your team? Olivia looked at him with that almost smile again. He asked me directly. Before the briefing, he walked up to me and said he knew he wasn't the most experienced operator in the room, but he thought he had something to contribute, and could he be on my team? I said yes. Marcus absorbed that. A junior operator, 8 months out of training, walking up to a commander before a joint evaluation and making a direct request. The confidence of that, the clarity of self-knowledge required to do it. What did you think when he asked? I thought he probably had something to contribute, she said simply. Because someone who knows what they have to offer and asks for the chance to offer it usually does. Marcus nodded slowly. He turned back toward the door. Behind him, Olivia said, Senior Chief. He turned. She was looking at him steadily, the coffee cup held in both hands, the analysis wall behind her with both decision trees still visible over her shoulder. What you did in that debrief yesterday, she said. What you said about your own plan, in front of all of them. She paused. That mattered. He held her gaze. It was just the truth. Most people don't say the truth in rooms that size, she said. At that cost, you chose to. He did not know what to say to that. So he nodded once and walked out. The corridor outside was busy now. Operators moving in both directions. The facility running at its morning pace. The machine of professional readiness in full operation. Marcus walked through it without changing his posture or his pace. From the outside, he looked the same as he always looked, deliberate, contained, entirely functional. Inside, he was doing something he had not done in a very long time. He was asking himself questions he did not already have the answers to. 3 hours later, he was running an afternoon evaluation session with a group of 12 operators, a pre-deployment readiness assessment, one of the standard formats he had run dozens of times. He set up the scenario briefing the way he always did. Then, before he launched into the framework, he stopped. He looked at the 12 operators in front of him. "Before I brief the plan," he said, "I want to know what each of you is most worried about. In this scenario, based on what you've read of the parameters," he paused. "Take a minute, think about it, then tell me." The 12 operators looked at him, then at each other, then back at him. A staff sergeant named Kwan, who had 4 deployments and a reputation as one of the more technically sound operators in the pre-deployment group, said slowly, "What we're most worried about." "Yes," Marcus said, "not what we think the plan should be." "Not yet," Marcus said. "What are you worried about?" Another pause, and then Kwan said, "Honestly, the communication dependency in the second phase. If the relay goes down, we lose coordination between the main element and the support element, and we've got no fallback protocol." Marcus said, "Okay, who else?" And one by one, the 12 operators began to speak. By the time they had finished, Marcus had 6 pieces of information he had not had before, 6 specific concerns, 6 angles on the scenario that his own read of the parameters had not surfaced. He built the brief around those concerns. He incorporated 2 of them directly into the contingency framework in ways that changed the plan he had originally prepared. When the session ended and the evaluation scores came in, the group's performance was the highest he had recorded in 4 years of running those assessments. He sat with that number for a while. Then he pulled out a notebook, an actual paper notebook, the kind he had used in the field for the same reason he had always used them. Because paper does not crash, and paper does not require a charge. And paper is honest in a way that digital interfaces sometimes aren't. And he wrote at the top of a clean page, "What are they worried about?" He looked at that line for a moment. Then he wrote underneath it, "Ask before you brief." He closed the notebook. He looked out the window of the instruction room at the operators still working the evaluation floor, moving through drills and scenarios, and the accumulated physical language of people who had trained for a long time and were still training. Somewhere in that facility, he knew, Olivia Hayes was doing the same work he was doing. Planning, assessing, preparing for the next day's evaluation schedule. They had spoken that morning with the specific honesty of 2 people who had shown each other something real, and that conversation sat in him now not as a wound and not as a victory, but as something more durable than either of those things. A direction. He was not yet sure where it led. He was not the kind of man who pretended to know the destination before he had walked the ground. But he was a man who, when he found a direction worth walking, did not stop. He picked up the notebook and his gear and walked out into the afternoon to continue the work. The classified file arrived in his secure inbox at 8:47 the following morning. There was no cover note, no explanation attached. Just the file itself, transferred through the internal system with a clearance notation Marcus had to read twice, because the level it carried was significantly higher than he had expected from a training and evaluation officer. He had assumed Olivia's record would reflect a solid operational background, the kind of career that produced competent instructors and credible evaluators. What he opened instead was something that required him to sit down before he finished the first section. The file was 43 pages. The first 8 were standard biographical and service record material entry date, training pipeline, initial assignments, promotion sequence. He moved through those quickly because that information, while solid, was not the thing that had been buried. The thing that had been buried started on page 9. 5 years and 4 months earlier, a joint reconnaissance team had been inserted into a region Marcus recognized from his own operational history, a mountainous corridor that had been active for years, where multiple previous operations had encountered the same category of problem. Intelligence that was accurate at insertion and wrong within hours, because the environment changed faster than the information cycle. The mission parameters on page 9 were familiar in their structure and catastrophic in their outcome potential. The team had gone in with solid intelligence, a reliable extraction plan, and a communication system that had worked perfectly in every previous deployment. Within 6 hours, all three of those assets had failed simultaneously. The intelligence had been compromised before insertion. The extraction route had been blocked by a repositioning of hostile elements that had occurred in the 12-hour window between the last satellite pass and the team's boots hitting the ground. And the communication system, the one that had worked perfectly in every previous deployment, had encountered a frequency suppression environment that nobody had anticipated because nobody had mapped that specific interference pattern in that specific corridor. The team had been 8 people. Olivia Hayes had been the most junior officer in the group, holding a position as the reconnaissance element leader. The mission commander had been a lieutenant commander named Garrett, who, by every account in the file, was an experienced and capable officer who made the decisions that his training and his experience told him to make, and whose decisions, in that specific environment, on that specific night, were exactly wrong in every particular. Marcus read that section slowly. He understood from his own career the specific cruelty of that situation. An operator who had done everything right, trained correctly, deployed correctly, assessed the situation, using every tool available, arriving at a moment where the tools and the training produced the wrong answer. It was not incompetence. It was the point where experience, unchecked by new information, became a liability instead of an asset. When the communication system failed and the extraction route closed, Garrett had made a command decision to push toward the original extraction point regardless. Because the original point was known and the alternative was unknown, and in his operational philosophy, a known problem was always preferable to an unknown one. He had issued the order and begun moving. Olivia Hayes had stopped moving. The file recorded the exchange between them in the official review language, which was precise and stripped of emotion, but communicated everything that had actually happened with absolute clarity. She had told him in direct terms that pushing to the original extraction point would move the team into the highest concentration of hostile repositioning, and that the probability of successful extraction through that route had dropped to a level she was not willing to accept. He had told her to follow the order. She had told him she would not follow the order until he heard what she had assessed about their actual situation. What followed was 4 minutes of direct confrontation in a hostile environment with the team stationary and exposed. 4 minutes during which Olivia presented, from the information she had gathered over the preceding 6 hours, from every member of the team communications, the medic, both junior operators, the signal specialist attached from another unit, a picture of their actual operational environment that differed from the commander's understanding in 5 critical ways. The hostile repositioning pattern was not random. It was following the team's movement signature, the same predictive response that the simulation had used against Marcus 2 days ago, because that simulation had been built, in part, from the pattern analysis that Olivia had written up in the aftermath of this very mission. She had a secondary option, not a clean option, not a safe option. A possible option, a route the signals specialist had identified in the 3rd hour because Olivia had asked him what he was picking up from the interference pattern. And what he had picked up. When he listened carefully and reported what he heard rather than what made operational sense, was a frequency corridor that suggested a gap in the hostile communication network. A gap that corresponded to a physical position, a position that corresponded to an egress route the team had not been briefed on because it had not existed in the original operational picture. Marcus stopped reading. He sat in his chair and looked at the far wall of his office and breathed. The logistics operator on Olivia's evaluation team. The one whose specialty was finding secondary routes. The one who had asked what happens when the primary option fails. Marcus had assumed Olivia had selected her for a reason she had not explained. He understood the reason now. Olivia had not been building a random team of unconventional selections. She had been reconstructing, in simulation, the team architecture that had saved her life in that mountain corridor 5 years ago. She had been selecting for the specific diversity of attention, the different kinds of worry, the different angles of professional concern that had produced the information that kept 8 people alive on a night when all of them should have died. She had tested it in the field, in real conditions. And then she had built it into a methodology and written it up, and it had become, under a classification level that Marcus now understood was not standard, the foundation of a program that existed precisely because what had happened in that corridor was not supposed to have happened, and the only reason it had worked was a junior officer who had been asking questions nobody else was asking. He turned back to the file. The 4 minutes of confrontation had ended with Garrett making a decision that the official review described as a demonstration of leadership flexibility under extreme pressure, which was the institutional language for a man who had been wrong, who had been told he was wrong by someone he had not expected to be told that by, and who had been large enough in that moment to change course. Garrett had listened. He had looked at what Olivia was presenting. He had asked 2 questions and received 2 answers. And he had said move. They had used the secondary route. All 8 operators had extracted. 0 casualties. The official review ran to 11 pages. Marcus read everyone. The language was careful and professional, and contained, in its careful professional way, a level of institutional acknowledgement that was rare enough to register even in that format. The review board had concluded that the mission's success was attributable to a subordinate officer's application of collaborative information synthesis in conditions of extreme operational stress language. That, translated out of institutional form, meant she asked the right questions and listened to the answers, and it saved everyone. Garrett had submitted a personal commendation addendum to the review. It was 2 paragraphs. Marcus read both of them. The first paragraph described the operational facts, Olivia's specific actions, the information she had presented, the route decision, the extraction. The second paragraph said, I have been an operational commander for 19 years. I have made decisions under pressure in conditions that would stop most people entirely. I am writing this addendum because the most important thing I learned in 19 years happened in 4 minutes, in a hostile corridor, when an officer junior to me told me I was wrong, and I initially responded by telling her to follow the order. She was right. I was wrong. The fact that I am able to submit this document at all is because she did not stop pushing until I heard her. Every commander I have worked with should read what she wrote and understand that the best decision you will ever make in the field may be the one comes from the person you least expected to be right. Marcus closed the file. He sat for a moment. Then he opened it again and reread the second paragraph of Garrett's addendum. Then he closed it again. He thought about the challenge. You will never beat me. He thought about what had lived underneath those words, the specific architecture of a professional identity built on the assumption that experience accumulated into authority, and authority into correctness, and correctness into a position that did not need to be questioned because it had already proven itself. Not overnight, not all at once. He thought about what Garrett had written about those 4 minutes, and what it had cost him to change direction mid-mission, and what it had meant for 8 people that he had been able to do it. He picked up his phone. He called Torres. Torres answered on the second ring. The Western Corridor, Marcus said. First phase of the evaluation. Were you worried about it? A pause. Longer than Torres usually paused before answering. Senior Chief, I'm not asking for accountability. I'm asking what you thought. Another pause. Then yeah. I was worried about it. I'd seen that approach pattern get predicted in the 21 exercise. Different scenario, but same fundamental structure. I thought there was a possibility the simulation's hostile AI would be calibrated to recognize it. Why didn't you say so? The pause this time was the kind that contained something real, and Marcus waded through it without filling it. You came in with the plan ready, Torres said. It was solid. You'd clearly already thought it through. I didn't want to. He stopped. Didn't want to what? Introduce doubt into a brief that was already clean. It felt like the wrong moment. Like, raising a concern at that point would slow us down more than the concern itself was worth. Marcus absorbed that. So you carried the doubt and didn't say it. Yeah, and the doubt was correct. Torres said nothing for a moment. Then yeah, the doubt was correct. Marcus thanked him and ended the call. He sat with the phone in his hand for a moment before setting it down. Torres had been carrying information that was worth knowing and had not said it because the brief had been structured in a way that made speaking up feel like the wrong call. The doubt had gone down. That was what Olivia had said. Marcus had not created space for doubt in his brief, and so the doubt had gone down, and the mission had recorded 6 casualties that a different preparation period might have prevented. He stood up and walked to the window. The training facility was visible from his office, the evaluation floor, the equipment areas, the pathways between buildings along which operators moved in the steady, professional rhythm of a day's work. He watched it for a while, without seeing any of it in particular. He was building something in his head, not a plan yet. Something earlier than a plan, the shape of an understanding that had been forming since the morning he stood at the analysis wall with Olivia, and was clarifying now with each piece of information he added into something that had edges and dimensions and a weight he could feel. He had been a good commander. He believed that. The record supported it. The missions, the deployments, the people who had worked under him and were still operational and were still alive. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. Because in his world, the measure of a commander was ultimately that simple and that absolute. But good was not the same as complete, and complete was not the same as right for every situation. And the situations had been changing, in ways he had been aware of professionally, but had not, until this week, felt the direct pressure of in his own practice. The hostiles in that simulation had been programmed to recognize standard SEAL movement patterns because in the actual operational environments, that program had been built to reflect. The adversaries had been doing exactly that, learning the patterns, mapping the predictable structures of how an elite American military force moved and communicated and made decisions, and designing responses that exploited the predictability. The tactical advantage that came from disciplined, trained consistency was real. And it had a ceiling, and above that ceiling, consistency became a vulnerability. Olivia had written that, in the methodology documents. He had read it twice. He turned from the window and picked up his notebook. He opened it to the page where he had written "Ask before you brief." He looked at that line. Then he wrote underneath it, "The doubt that goes down is the information you needed." He stared at that for a moment. Then he wrote, "Garrett heard her. 4 minutes, 8 people alive." He closed the notebook. He had a session with his senior instructor cohort in 40 minutes. 8 instructors who reported to him, who trained the operators who went through the combat center, who were responsible for the quality of the tactical education that the community received. He had been leading that cohort for 2 years. They trusted his judgment. They ran their sessions according to the framework he had established, which was a solid framework built on his experience, refined through observation, producing consistent and measurable results. He walked into that session, and he did something he had not done in 2 years of leading the cohort. He started by asking them what they were worried about. Not what they thought the curriculum needed. Not what their performance metrics showed. What they were worried about, in their sessions, in the training, in what they were seeing, in the operators, moving through the program. The first response was silence, the specific silence of people recalibrating. These were experienced instructors. They were not accustomed to being asked that question at the start of a session. Then Instructor Hendricks, a woman who had spent 11 years as a combat controller before transitioning to instruction, said quietly, "I'm worried we're training people to execute plans, but not to question them." The room shifted. Another instructor, a chief named Palomares, said, "I'm worried about the time pressure in the evaluation cycle." Operators are learning to move faster instead of learning to think better. Those aren't the same thing. A third instructor, a man named Wu, who rarely spoke in group settings, but whose session reviews were consistently the highest in the cohort, said, "I'm worried about what we're not testing. We test speed, accuracy, communication under pressure. We don't test whether operators can receive new information and change a plan they already believe in." Marcus wrote that one down without commenting on it. By the time the round was complete, he had 8 concerns from 8 instructors. 6 of them described real problems. 2 of them described problems he had been aware of in a general way, but had not addressed because they required a kind of curricular change that would encounter institutional resistance. He had known the resistance was there, and had, without making a conscious decision to do it, been navigating around it. He looked at his notes. He looked at the 8 instructors looking at him. "These are real problems," he said. "All of them. I've seen most of them. I haven't addressed them adequately. That changes today." Hendricks said, "What does that mean practically?" "It means we redesign the evaluation cycle to include what Wu just described. A test of whether operators can receive new information and change a plan they believe in. Under pressure, with time constraints, scored on quality of adaptation, not just quality of execution." Palomares said, "That's going to change the metrics." "Yes," Marcus said, "it is. Command may push back on a metrics change." "Command may," Marcus agreed. "I'll handle that when it happens." The session ran for 90 minutes. By the end of it, Marcus had a draft framework for 3 curricular changes that he had not walked in with. The changes were better, not all at once. The changes were better than anything he would have produced alone, because they were built from the specific expertise of 8 people who spent their days in direct contact with the problem the changes were designed to solve. He had not briefed them on his plan. He had asked them what they were worried about, and what they were worried about had built a better plan than his. He stayed late that night to write up the framework in the form the institution required. He was 2 hours into the document when his secure inbox flagged a new message. It was from Olivia, 2 lines. "I heard about the cohort session from Hendricks. She said you asked what they were worried about. I wanted to say that's the whole thing." That's exactly it. He read it twice. Then he typed back, "I read the file. All 43 pages, including Garrett's addendum." He waited. The reply came 4 minutes later. "He sent me a copy of that addendum 3 years after the mission. I didn't know he'd written it until then. I sat with it for a long time." Marcus typed, "He heard you." A pause. Longer this time. Then, "He heard me because I didn't stop, but also because he was the kind of man who could change direction. That's rarer than the stopping. Any junior officer can push. It takes something different to be the senior person who turns." Marcus sat with that for a long time. He thought about 4 minutes in a mountain corridor. He thought about 8 people who had come home. He thought about a junior officer who had asked questions all night and compiled answers into a picture that saved everyone, and a commander who had initially said follow the order, and then, when pressed, had heard the truth and changed course. He thought about what it had taken for Garrett to do that. In that moment, in the field, with the mission on him, and his rank, and his experience, and his professional identity, all pushing in the direction of the decision he had already made. He typed, "What happened to Garrett?" The reply came quickly this time. "He retired 2 years after the mission. He teaches at the Naval War College now. He sent me something else last year, a paper one of his students wrote about adaptive command decision-making." The student cited the mountain corridor case from the declassified section of the review. Didn't know Garrett was in the room. Marcus sat back. "What did Garrett do?" He told the student the full story. Everything the classified file contains. And then he told the class, "The best thing I ever did in 30 years of command was change my mind in 4 minutes when a junior officer told me I was wrong. The second best thing I ever did was admit it in writing." Marcus looked at that message for a moment. Then he set down the phone and picked up his pen and opened his notebook to a new page. At the top he wrote, "What Garrett knew." And underneath that, he wrote the thing that had been forming in him since the morning at the analysis wall. Since the phone call with Torres, since the 43 pages of a classified file, and the 4 minutes in a mountain corridor that a junior officer had refused to let collapse into a wrong decision. The mission does not care about your rank. It only cares whether you heard the truth in time. He closed the notebook. Outside the window, the training facility had gone dark and quiet, the way bases go dark and quiet late at night, not empty, because they are never empty, but reduced to the essential functions, the watch standing, the overnight crews running their rotations, the minimum operational presence of a community that is always, at some level, working. Marcus sat in that quiet for a while and let the day's weight settle into him. Not the weight of loss, something different, the weight of a man who has been carrying a structure he built a long time ago and has begun for the first time to seriously examine whether the structure still serves the work. He had been good, he remained good, that was not in question. The question, the one that Olivia Hayes had introduced into his professional life 2 days ago. Standing at a briefing board and saying the plan has a structural problem was whether being good was enough anymore, or whether the moment had arrived when good required something more. Required the addition of a capacity he had been walking past for years without stopping to develop. The capacity to hear the truth from someone he had not expected to have it. He had begun developing it today, in a cohort session that had produced better results than anything he had run in 2 years. In a phone call with Torres that had cost him something and returned something larger. In 43 pages of a classified file that had shown him, in the specific detail of a real mission on a real night with real people, what was at stake when that capacity was absent, and what was possible when it was present. He was not finished. He understood that with the clarity of a man who has been doing serious work long enough to know the difference between a beginning and a conclusion. But he had started. He had actually started. And in his experience, in his long experience of the real cost of hard things, that was the part that most people never managed. He put on his jacket, gathered his notes, and walked out into the dark of the base, moving with the same deliberate pace he always carried, the same upright posture, the same contained professional presence that operators had been reading as certainty for 16 years. The certainty was still there. It had simply become, in the last 48 hours, a different kind of certain. 3 weeks after the evaluation, Marcus Reed stood in front of the largest group he had addressed since the day of the challenge. Not 1,040 operators this time, 47. The full instructor cohort from Naval Special Warfare Combat Center, assembled for the quarterly curriculum review, the formal session where the training command assessed what was working, what needed adjustment, and what direction the next quarter's program would take. It was a standard institutional event. It ran the same way every quarter. People expected it to run the same way this quarter. It did not run the same way this quarter. Marcus had spent 3 weeks preparing. Not preparing his talking points, he had not written talking points, because what he was bringing into that room was not a presentation. It was a restructured curriculum framework built from 6 weeks of work that had started with a cohort session where he had asked 8 instructors what they were worried about and had not stopped building since. The framework sat in a document on the table in front of him, 41 pages, which was not a coincidence because he had read Olivia's 43-page file 3 times in the preceding weeks, and the symmetry was not lost on him. Before he opened the document, he looked at the room. 47 instructors, people who had between them more combined operational time than most small nations' entire military histories. People who had been doing this work for years and who trusted the system they had been working inside because the should produce results, and results in their world were the only honest argument. Before I present anything, Marcus said, I want to tell you where this came from. The room was quiet. That was not unusual. Marcus Reed's sessions were always quiet at the start because people paid attention to him. But there was a quality to this quiet that was slightly different. An alertness, because the statement before I present anything implied something other than what they were used to from him. He told them about the evaluation. Not as an institutional case study, they all knew the basic facts of what had happened. Because in a professional community of this size, nothing stays localized for long. He told them the interior version, the preparation period, the challenge, the decision tree that had produced 6 casualties against a 0. The conversation at the analysis wall at 600 the following morning. The classified file, Torres's phone call, Garrett's addendum. He told them all of it. When he finished, the room was quiet in a different way than it had been at the start. The alertness had deepened into something more complex, the specific quality of experienced people hearing something honest that they recognize from the inside because they have carried similar weight and have not said so. Hendricks was the first to speak. You're telling us this because the framework comes from that. I'm telling you this because the framework comes from that, and you need to know where it comes from in order to trust it, Marcus said. And because anything I'm asking you to change about how you train, I've already changed about how I work. Palomar said, What specifically are you changing? Marcus opened the document. 3 things. First, the evaluation cycle. We're adding what Wu identified 3 weeks ago. A scored assessment of adaptive plan revision under pressure. Operators will be tested, not just on execution quality, but on the quality of their response when the plan they believe in stops working. We will score that. We will track it. We will make it a core metric. Wu, sitting near the back of the room, said nothing. But his posture changed in the specific way that posture changes when a person hears their words spoken 3 weeks earlier into a room where they were not sure they would come back as institutional policy. He sat slightly straighter, a small movement, significant in its smallness. Second, Marcus continued, the briefing protocol changes. Before any mission brief at the senior evaluation level, the briefing commander is required to conduct an open question round with the full team. Not a question period at the end of a completed brief. A question round before the plan is presented. The purpose is to surface what the team is carrying before the plan forecloses it. He paused. That's not a soft process change, it's a structural one. It will be slower at the start. It will produce better outcomes over time. A hand went up near the center of the room. An instructor named Calloway, who had been at the center for longer than almost anyone else present, and who had a reputation for asking exactly the question nobody wanted to answer. Senior Chief, Calloway said, the brief before the brief. How do you handle a team that gives you bad information? Inexperienced operators bringing in concerns that aren't operationally valid that costs time, and it can introduce false doubt into a plan that's actually sound. Good question, Marcus said. The commander's job doesn't change. You still evaluate what you hear. You still make the final call. What changes is that you hear it before the plan is locked, not after, and hearing it before costs nothing. Hearing it after costs 6 casualties. Calloway held the look for a moment. Then he nodded, not easily, with the particular quality of someone who disagrees and is choosing to engage rather than resist. What about operators who don't speak up even in the open round? The ones who carry the doubt and don't say it regardless of the structure. Marcus thought of Torres. He thought of what Edis had said. The brief was clean. It felt like the wrong moment. Raising the concern would slow things down more than the concern was worth. He thought about the specific social physics of a room where authority is established and operational confidence is high and doubt feels like a liability. We build the culture over time, he said, one brief at a time. One session at a time. Operators learn that the open round is real, that what they say in it actually changes things, and they start speaking. The first time it happens and the plan improves because of what someone said in that round, the culture takes a step. The second time, it takes another step. You can't mandate psychological safety. You can create the conditions for it to develop. That's what we're doing. Calloway said. And the third change? The third change, Marcus said, is that we bring Commander Hayes into the curriculum development process formally. He let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. Her adaptive leadership methodology has been applied in field conditions and produced results in circumstances where standard approaches failed. It is not theoretical. It is not a simulation tool. It is a tested system that we are not currently teaching, and we should be teaching it. The room's quality of attention shifted again, because this was the statement that carried the most weight, not procedurally, but personally. Every operator in that room understood what it meant for Marcus Reed to stand in front of the institution that had watched him lose a challenge and recommend that the person who had beaten him be brought in to shape how the institution taught leadership. Hendricks said quietly, "You cleared that with Commander Hayes?" "I sent her the framework 2 days ago," Marcus said. "She had 4 notes. All 4 were improvements. I incorporated 3 and pushed back on 1 which she accepted. The document in front of you reflects what we built together." He watched the room process that. He watched the instructors experienced, careful, professional people absorb the specific information that the framework they were being asked to implement was not the product of one commander's revised thinking, but of a collaboration between 2 people who had been 3 weeks earlier on opposite sides of a public challenge. Palomar said, "You pushed back on one of her notes." "Yes, she accepted it, yes." "What was the note?" Marcus said, "She wanted to include a section on when not to ask the open question round. Specific scenario types where the time constraint makes the round counterproductive. I pushed back because I think that section creates a structural excuse to skip the step under pressure, which is exactly when the step is most needed." She agreed after I walked through my reasoning. Palomares looked at him for a moment. "So you told her she was wrong and she listened." Marcus held the look. "Yes, and you were right. In that particular instance," Marcus said, "I was right. There will be instances where she is right, and I'm the one listening. That's the architecture." The room was quiet again. But it was the quiet of something having settled, not the end of a question, but the beginning of an understanding. The difference between 47 instructors sitting in a curriculum review and 47 instructors sitting with a new way of thinking about what they were there to do. The session ran for 3 hours. Every section of the framework was examined. Multiple instructors raised objections, some of which were strong enough to produce genuine, back-and-forth moments where Marcus's position was pressed, and he either held it with reasoning or adjusted it when the reasoning on the other side was better. He adjusted 4 times. He held firm 9 times. By the end, the framework had changed in 11 specific details from the version he had walked in with, and it was better in 11 specific ways than it had been. When the session ended and people began moving toward the door, Calloway stopped beside Marcus. He stood there for a moment without saying anything, in the way that people, who are not naturally comfortable with certain kinds of conversation, stand before they make themselves have the conversation anyway. "The Western Corridor," Calloway said finally. "In the evaluation. I was watching from the observation area. I saw you adjust your route mid-mission." Marcus waited. "I've been doing this for 22 years, Calloway said. I have never, in 22 years of evaluations, seen a senior operator of your level house plan mid-mission in a way that clearly reflected information from outside their own framework. Not just a tactical adjustment, a conceptual adjustment. You changed what you thought the problem was." He stopped. "I'm telling you I saw that because it matters that I say it." Marcus looked at him. "Why? Because the operators I've trained who are most likely to get people killed are not the ones who don't know enough. They're the ones who stopped being willing to change what they thought they knew. And you are not that, Senior Chief. Whatever happened in that evaluation, you are not that." The words arrived in Marcus with a precision that surprised him. Not because they were flattering, because they were the specific thing he had been most afraid of. Not the loss. Not the public challenge reversed. The possibility that the evaluation had revealed something in him that was permanent, a rigidity, a closedness, a structure that had calcified past the point of revision. Calloway was telling him it had not, and Calloway, in 22 years, was not someone who said things he did not mean. "Thank you," Marcus said. The words were simple. They carried everything. Calloway nodded once and walked out. The room emptied until Marcus was alone with the 41-page document and the institutional quiet of a building that had just processed something and would be different tomorrow for having processed it. He stood at the front of the room for a moment. Then he picked up the document and his notebook and walked. He found Olivia in the simulation analysis room, which was where she spent most of her afternoons working through the data from the evaluation cycle, building the methodology documents that the classified program used as its foundation, occasionally running individual operators through a modified version of the assessment to gather the kind of qualitative data that did not show up in standard evaluation metrics. She was doing exactly that when Marcus appeared in the doorway. A junior operator was sitting across from her, and from the posture of the exchange, Marcus could tell she was asking the operator something. The operator was talking carefully, choosing words. She was listening the way she always listened, with her full attention, without filling the silence prematurely. She glanced up when Marcus appeared. She held up one finger 1 minute and turned back to the operator. Marcus waited in the doorway. The exchange ran for another 4 minutes. At the end of it, the operator looked different than he had looked at the start. Not dramatically, but in the specific way that people look when they have said something honest, in a context where honesty was invited and received, and the saying of it has slightly reorganized something in them. He stood, shook Olivia's hand with a formality that was actually respect, and moved past Marcus out the door with a nod. Olivia looked at Marcus. How did the curriculum review go? The framework passed, Marcus said, with 11 amendments. All improvements, she said. Which of my 4 notes did you reject? The carve-out for time-constrained scenarios. She considered that for a moment. Then, you were right to reject it. I knew you were right when you pushed back. I think I included it because I was anticipating institutional resistance and trying to give the framework a retreat route. I know, Marcus said. That's why I pushed back. Retreat routes in the framework become retreat routes in the field. She nodded slowly. Are they bringing me in formally? Yes, I named it in the curriculum review. Formally in front of the full cohort. He paused. No one objected. Olivia said Calloway didn't object. Calloway was the one who stopped to speak to me after. Told me he'd watched 22 years of evaluations, and the route adjustment in the second phase was the most significant conceptual shift he'd seen a senior operator make in real time. Something moved across Olivia's face, something she did not quite let become a full expression, but that was present enough to see. He said that to you. He said it was important that he say it. She was quiet for a moment. Then Calloway was my evaluation board instructor when I came through this center. 12 years ago. A pause. He told me at the end of my evaluation that I had the right instincts, but that nobody would listen to me for at least 10 years, because I was asking questions the institution wasn't ready to answer yet. She stopped. He wasn't wrong. Marcus looked at her. He was right about the 10 years? Give or take, she said. 12 years. 1 mountain corridor. 1 simulation. 1 very loud challenge in front of 1,000 people. A brief pause. The almost smile. Now they're ready. Marcus set the framework document on the table between them. There's something I want to add to the methodology, he said. A section I did not include in the curriculum review because I'm still developing it. I want your input before I formalize it. Olivia looked at the document. What section? What happens when the junior person is wrong? Marcus said. Your method is built on creating space for information to surface from every level of the team. That's the right architecture. But the architecture has a failure mode, an operator who surfaces information confidently and incorrectly, and a commander who has been trained to receive that information with openness and responds to the wrong call because the system told them to listen. Olivia looked at him steadily. You're asking how to build a filter that doesn't undermine the openness. Yes. She sat back in her chair. She was quiet for almost 20 seconds, the specific quiet of someone doing real thinking rather than preparing an answer. Then she said, you evaluate the information, not the source. And you evaluate it in context, not in isolation. An operator who surfaces a concern, you don't accept the concern because they surfaced it. You take it seriously because it came from someone who was paying attention to something. Then you run it against everything else you know. If it holds up, it changes the plan. If it doesn't hold up, you tell them why, specifically, so they understand the reasoning. That's not rejecting the input, it's processing it, the same way you'd process any intelligence report. You assess it, you don't just receive it, Marcus said. What if you're wrong in the assessment? Then you were wrong, she said simply. That's what happened to Garrett in the first 4 minutes. He assessed my concern and concluded it wasn't strong enough to warrant changing the plan. He was wrong in that assessment, but he was doing the work. He was actually evaluating what I brought him, not dismissing it. That's why he was able to change direction when I kept pushing. The system was operating. It just needed more information to produce the right output. Marcus thought about that. So the method doesn't guarantee the right answer. It guarantees that the process of arriving at an answer is sound. Yes, she said, which maximizes the probability of the right answer. Over time, across enough decisions, in enough conditions, she paused. Nothing guarantees the right answer. Combat is not a system that produces guarantees. What we're building is a decision architecture that is more likely to hear the truth in time. That's all it is. That's everything it is. He sat with that for a long moment. The room was quiet around them. The simulation systems hummed at low operational frequency. The base continued its work outside, indifferent to the conversation happening inside this particular room between these two particular people. I told Torres, Marcus said, after I read the file. I called him and told him that his concern about the Western Corridor had been correct. Olivia waited. He said something I've been thinking about since. He said, Senior Chief, I've been in briefings my whole career where I had doubts and didn't say them. This is the first time a commander told me afterward that the doubt was right. Marcus stopped. He said it like it mattered, like the acknowledgement itself mattered, separate from whether anything changed. It does matter, Olivia said. When a commander acknowledges that the suppressed information was correct, it changes what the operator does the next time they're in a room. With information they're not sure, should say, it doesn't matter if it's after the fact. It still changes the next time. That's in the methodology? That's in the methodology, she confirmed. It should be in the curriculum, Marcus said, explicitly. Not as a principle, as a practice. After every evaluation debrief, the mission commander identifies at least one piece of information the team held and did not surface, and acknowledges it by name. Makes it specific, not a general statement about open communication. A specific instance of, you had this, you didn't say it, it mattered. Olivia looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and wrote something in the notebook that sat open beside her. That's the amendment I'm adding, she said, with your name on it. Marcus shook his head. No names. Why not? Because the methodology should outlast both of us, he said. Once it has names, it becomes a story about people. It should be a story about what works. She held the look. Then she put the pen down, agreed. They worked for another 2 hours. Side by side at the table, the framework between them, building something that neither of them would have built alone. Marcus brought the operational precision, the specific, detailed knowledge of how a mission brief runs, how teams move under pressure, where the decision architecture breaks down in the physical reality of execution. Olivia brought the structural understanding, the methodology framework, the research from the Mountain Corridor and the programs built after it, the academic and field-tested language that translated practical observation into teachable form. At one point, they disagreed sharply, a 10-minute exchange about how to structure the assessment scoring rubric that produced genuine friction. Two experienced people with different analytical frameworks pressing against the same problem and arriving at different answers. Marcus held his position for 6 minutes. Then Olivia said something that changed the geometry of his understanding sufficiently that he said, directly and without ceremony, "That's right. I was looking at it wrong." He picked up his pen and revised the section. Olivia wrote a note in her own notebook without commenting. At 9 that night, Torres appeared at the door. He looked between them, the table covered with documents, both of them still working, and said, "Command is asking for a summary of the curriculum changes by 800 tomorrow. Framework overview, 3 pages maximum." Marcus looked at Olivia. Split it, she agreed. Torres looked at them for another moment. Then he said to no one in particular, He left. Marcus wrote his section of the summary in 40 minutes. Olivia wrote hers in 35. They exchanged them, read each other's work, made 4 combined edits, and produced a 3-page summary that was, in Marcus's professional assessment, the clearest institutional document he had ever put his name on. Not because the writing was exceptional, it was functional and direct, which was all it needed to be, but because it said something real. It said what they were changing, why they were changing it, and what they expected the change to produce, and every sentence of it was true in a way that could be tested and measured, and either proved or disproved by the results that followed. At the bottom of the summary, Marcus printed both their names. He slid it across the table to Olivia. She looked at the 2 names. She looked at him. "You said no names on the methodology," she said. "The methodology outlasts us," he said. "The summary goes to command. Command needs to know who is accountable for this." She picked up the document. She looked at the names one more time. Then she nodded and initialed beside hers. He initialed beside his. They walked out of the simulation room together. The base was night quiet around them, the reduced operational hum of a facility that was always working but worked most quietly after 2100. They moved down the corridor, side by side, not walking in any hurry, carrying the particular quality of 2 people who have done serious work together and are temporarily between the work and whatever comes next. At the point where their paths diverged, where his route back to his quarters went one direction and hers went another, they stopped. Marcus said the challenge. Olivia looked at him. "I want to say it directly, not in a document, not in a session." Directly, he held her gaze. "I was wrong to issue it the way I issued it. You made a technical observation, and I made it personal because my framework had been pressed, and I did not sit with that without pushing back against the persons doing the pressing. That's on me. It produced an evaluation that was useful. That doesn't change that it was the wrong response." Olivia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And I was wrong to let it become a challenge instead of redirecting the conversation back to the plan. I had options. I chose the one that was more confrontational than it needed to be. You held your ground. Holding your ground and redirecting aren't mutually exclusive," she said. "I chose holding my ground because some part of me wanted the challenge to happen. Wanted the evaluation to answer the question publicly. That was not the purest motivation." Marcus looked at her. "And if it hadn't happened that way, if the challenge had never been issued, if you had redirected the conversation back to the plan, and we had run the evaluation without the direct competition." She considered that. The plan still had the structural problem. The evaluation would still have produced information. But this conversation, she gestured slightly, between them and behind them, at the direction they had come from. This conversation might not have happened. Not like this. So the challenge was wrong and useful at the same time. "Most things are," she said. "That's not an excuse for the wrong part." "But it is the truth," he nodded. They stood in the corridor for one more moment. Then Marcus said, "When the operators come through the adaptive assessment next quarter and they hit the point where their plan stops working, when the scenario gives them a variable their brief didn't account for, and they have to decide in real time whether to push the plan or revise it, what do you want them to know? If you could put one thing in their hands before that moment, what is it?" Olivia did not hesitate. "That revising is not losing," she said. "The plan is not the mission. The plan is a tool the mission uses until the mission needs a different tool. The commanders who can put down one plan and build another under pressure, in the field, with people watching, those are the commanders who bring their teams home." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That goes in the curriculum." "It's already in the methodology," she said. "Page 7. He looked at her. Then, for the first time in the entirety of their professional acquaintance through the evaluation, the analysis wall, the collaboration, the 3 weeks of building something new out of the wreckage of a challenge. He smiled. Not broadly, not performatively, the specific, understated smile of a man who has found himself in the company of someone who takes the work as seriously as he does, and whose understanding of it is deep enough to surprise him. "Good night, Commander," he said. "Good night, Senior Chief," she said. They moved in their separate directions. Marcus walked back to his quarters through the quiet base. He carried the summary document. He carried his notebook. He carried 48 hours of work that had produced something he was genuinely proud of, not because it was his, but because it was right. Because it had been tested against real experience, refined by honest disagreement, and built to outlast both of the people who had made it. In his quarters, before he turned out the light, he opened the notebook to the page he had written on 3 weeks ago. "Ask before you brief. The doubt that goes down is the information you needed." Garrett heard her. 4 minutes, 8 people alive. He read those lines one more time. Then he turned to a new page. He wrote, "The plan is a tool the mission uses until the mission needs a different tool." He looked at that for a moment. Then he wrote beneath it, "The commanders who can put one plan down and build another. Those are the commanders who bring their teams home." He closed the notebook. He turned out the light. And, in the dark, Senior Chief Marcus Reed, 16 years operational, 4 years instruction, 1 public challenge, and 1 honest loss, and 3 weeks of the hardest professional reconstruction he had ever undertaken, lay on his back and felt, for the first time since the evaluation, something that was not friction and not doubt and not the weight of a structure under examination. He felt ready, not the ready of a man who knows all the answers. The ready of a man who has learned at genuine cost how to hear them when they come from someone else. That was a harder ready. It took longer to build. It was less comfortable to carry. And it was, in every way that the real world eventually measured, more powerful than anything he had brought into that briefing room 3 weeks ago, when he had stepped forward in front of 1,000 people and said the words that had started all of this. The mission does not care who is right. It only cares whether the right answer reaches the person who needs it in time. Marcus Reed had spent 16 years learning to be the person with the answer. He had spent 3 weeks learning to be the person who could receive it. Both were necessary. Neither was enough alone. And the man who understood that, who had paid the price to understand it, and had done the work to build it into something real and lasting and teachable, that man was more dangerous to every problem the mission would ever put in front of him than he had ever been before. That was what 1,040 operators watched begin on the day of the challenge. And what began that day did not stop.